Okay, I'm going to see if I can say something useful about moss. So, what we're looking at right now is Syntrichia ruralis. Used to be called Tortula ruralis. And this is quite dry. But you can see little hairs on the leaf tips. This was collected at dry sites in, let's say, southwestern Colorado. And this is one of the more common mosses around here. Is hydrated. Let's see if I can. You got to increase the magnification so you can see the hairs on it. And that is one of the characteristics. But anyway, this is a bryophyte. It is a moss. Bryology is the study of mosses. But a lot of things fall into that category. So mosses are that category. Let's say mosses are like mammals. So the next group would be the liverworts. That's covered. But also things like sphagnum moss is a true moss. Well, not a true moss, sorry. That is studied in bryophytes. Here is some living sphagnum. This really deserves a little video all by itself. This is palustre. That's actually from Florida, and I use it in horticulturally. But it has some liverwort characteristics and some moss characteristics, but a lot of it's really saturated with water, and it's perfectly fine with that. But it produces different fruiting bodies than a true moss, and that is why it's in its own group. But anyway, it has the ability to draw many more times its body weight, so to speak, in water. And so anyway, perfectly alive. And it has its own anatomy and stuff like that. Although most sphagnums have, well, they have more in common than they don't have in common. It's true with a lot of things. But onwards and upwards. Let's see. This tiny thing. I don't know if it's going to help at all. But this is a leafy liverwort, and it is very tiny. It's probably better to look at that under a microscope. But it's kind of like a moss, and it's leafy. Oh, there we go. Maybe there's some detail. It's a central stalk, and then the leaves come off that. And so this is, let's say, if mosses were mammals, and sphagnum is, well, sphagnum might be the bird lineage. Leafy liverworts are kind of like reptiles, phylogenetically. And the amphibians would be the thalose liverworts. This one, I'm hoping it's Conocephalum. It probably is Merkentia. But anyway, I'm looking for fruiting bodies at some point. But I put it in a plastic bag about a week or two ago, and it's producing these new thalose structures. And so I'll refer back to this soon. This is one of the more primitive forms of the liverworts, and there's some mosses right there. So there's lots of things. So this is growing in a fairly moist habitat, but not submerged. Although some of these thalose liverworts can be submerged. But anyway, keeping that in mind, put that here. Oh, they're in focus. But anyway, these are all non-vascular. Oh, come on, focus. Because it has an interesting texture. So anyway, these are non-vascular plants. In other words, they don't have any tissue in them that actually conveys water or nutrients through their body, so to speak. So they just absorb everything like a sponge. And this is fairly succulent. It actually does have rhizoids. So that's not a terribly good example, but most of the mosses, they basically are 1 to 2 cell thick leaves, and so they absorb things like a living sponge, and that makes them very sensitive to pollution. But interestingly enough, they can dry out totally, like this guy, and then bounce back to that. Well, now it's already drying out. Bounce back to a living organism, photosynthetic living organism. There is a moss that was, let's see, where are we? Here's a little moss. And there was a moss called dicranum, which let's see, it's worth of something or other. But on the Oregon coast, where a biologist sat there in a tree and watched it dry out and then become hydrated and dry out again some 40 times. And so when it hydrates, it starts photosynthesizing, and when it dehydrates, it stops. And it did that 40 times in a day. And I'm sure he got paid pretty well. Anyway, and a terribly nice guy too. But anyway, this particular moss is Bryum argenteum, and this is the dry phase, and this is, as far as relevance go, this is one that you'll see in the cracks of sidewalks, and well, I tend to find it around gutters and stuff like that, where it's periodically moist. It's, I think, originally supposed to be from Australia, but it likes limey substrates. Here it is, hydrated argenteum. Let's see if we can get some magnification here. Come on. Yeah, maybe not. Well, but anyway, this is a little moss that grows straight up. But anyway, as a visual, so the leaves are, I don't know, I'll get there eventually. The leaves have kind of a whitish tip, makes them look silver. That's why, hence the species name argenteum. But anywho, what mosses do is they have a gametophyte and a sporophyte stage, and the gametophyte produces gametes, in other words, sex cells, and those go out into the world. Well, actually, they gametophytes breed with each other and produce a structure called a sporophyte, and the sporophyte produces spores, as the name suggests, and the spores turn into things like that, what you're seeing. And that's called alternation of generation. So what you're looking at is actually a diploid. The gametophytes, which look like the thalose liverwort, generally speaking, not as much texture, usually kind of boiled green. Oh, that's rather boiled green right there. Is a haploid, so it has half the chromosomes. And so when you look at a moss, what you're looking at is a haploid, so it doesn't really have any recessive characteristics. It can be hidden. It is what it is. That's why they're used in genetic research. But the sporophyte is the little thing that comes off the top. And I wish I had a good example of a sporophyte. I am having terrible trouble with finding a good sporophyte for identification. but they look like a little hair that comes off the top of these, and that actually is a diploid, and that produces the spores that in turn, which are haploid and which produce the gametophyte. And so this awkwardness makes them reasonably well, it makes them vulnerable to the environment. So in human beings, for instance, our gametophyte is gone down to a single cell. It's called a sperm and an egg. And we are the sporophytes. I think that works out logically. But most ferns and Saginellas and various other relatives, larger vascular plant relatives, do have this alternation of generations. It's just there's variations on the theme. Mosses are a little bit more, I'm going to say simple because it takes a lot for them to reproduce, so they tend to reproduce vegetatively. And that's why you see patches. So it's kind of a challenge for the little guys. But they've managed to, they can get their spores into the air and travel around the world. And so you'll often find mosses native to the Pacific Northwest and the British Isles and Japan, actually, and New Zealand. If you need an example, let's see, Philadelphus? No, that's a vascular plant. Rhytinia delphus. There you go. Different species. I don't know why we're writing here. Different species. Well, the same species can be found in Oregon, England, and New Zealand, and how that happened is called wind currents. But anyways, they're searching, the spores are searching out the right habitat, so to speak, not to personify them, but go back to the thalose liverwort for a little bit. See if we can get some focus here. It has some interesting texture. There you go. But anyway, this is also not unusual for lichens as well. But anyway, this is a fascinating group of plants. They are true plants. They do not have vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is basically wood, xylem and phloem. There is a family of mosses, Polytrichaceae, the pine tree moss, found a lot in Japanese gardens. That does have some vascular tissue, but it's derived from the dermis, so it's got to have a different name. So they're heptoids and hydroids and leptoids, if I recall. But in the tropics, some of these members of that family, since they do have vascular tissue and they can move nutrients through the tissue, they can become very, very large. So there are species that are, good 30 centimeters, 60 centimeters, and so forth. But the ones we have here, like Polytrichium communis, or Juniperinum in the drier areas, they look like little bottle brushes and so forth, and a very nice setae, in which are the fruiting structure, which basically looks like a hair with a salt sugar on the end, metaphorically speaking, to shed the spores. But anyway, I think this is an underappreciated group of plants. They're a little bit challenging because you need to pull off a leaf and then put it under a compound microscope and then examine it under at least, well, let's say 100 power, to get the cell structure, and then you identify them by the cell structure or how many barbs are on the hairs and so forth. So, and fairly complicated, but like any group of plants, it has its own charming vocabulary and so forth. But and I haven't even mentioned hornworts, which are related to what you're kind of looking at as far as structure goes. The fruiting bodies on liverworts are fantastic. They look very alien. Mosses, kind of the same. Sphagnum, the fruiting bodies will be little balls, and they'll explode when they dry out, which is interesting, which is seems to me more of a liverwort characteristic. But a lot of these have very cartoonish looking fruiting bodies, and they're astonishingly ancient. So this goes back to the very root of the plant kingdom. So these guys branched off a terribly long time ago. They haven't even invented, the reduced gametophytes that we see in, well, even gymnosperms like pines. The gametophyte is quite small, but it does sit on a modified branch, in which is what we call a cone. So you open up a pine cone, you'll see the scars of the. So it's just naked sitting there. Hence the name gymnosperms, naked seeds. And then, of course, flowering plants have a enclosed seed and usually covered with some sort of tasty structure for some sort of animal or wind. It has a wing to be blown about, so the ability to endure a multitude of habitats pushes the plants in the more sophisticated necessarily direction. Although we do have things like ginkgos and mosses that are plainly in existence, and they are all these organisms are at the tips of their evolutionary branches. Nothing's necessarily more primitive. So, but despite there's pros and cons to the whole spreading your spores all over the universe, and then hoping all over the world, I should say. I don't want to draw conclusions. And landing in the appropriate spots and germinating. So, as I said, these things have traveled. Although some of that traveling could have been done, basically they spread throughout Gondwana land, and then Gondwana land broke up, and that's how they got where they got. But New Zealand is rather distant from Pacific Northwest United States. So anyway, next time you see a moss, hopefully, you'll think kindly upon it. It's not garbage or anything like that. They're absolutely fascinating. Liverworts, Google liverwort sporophytes. It's astonishing. Like looking at alien living life forms. Anyway, there you go. A primer on bryology.